China is one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. It is also the largest nation in Asia until recently, when India overtook China with the biggest population on Earth. Nevertheless, China is one of the most remarkable cases of economic and political transformation in human history. It went from an isolated communist nation under Chairman Mao into a global manufacturing and now even technological powerhouse. Meanwhile, China's political system has gone through a lot of evolution, but nevertheless remains under the iron grip of a single man, chairman and paramount leader Xi Jinping. But geopolitically, China is looking more and more like another rising superpower and the complications that come with that. For some, China represents nothing less than a massive opportunity to create a new international order and to end America's hegemony. But for many in the Philippines, China represents nothing short of a threat, a national security threat, a rising power that is engaging in creeping invasion of our sovereign waters. The China question has been at the center of Philippine foreign policy for decades, and most especially in the past decade as the tensions in the West Philippine Sea rose. Different administrations came out with different strategies. If anything, we saw 50 shades of different strategies by even single administrations, as each president, including pro-China President Duterte or not so pro-China presidents, trying to cope with the evolution and increasing assertiveness of China. So the question is, do we properly understand China? What are the motivations of China? Is China a threat or opportunity or both? And how should the Philippines navigate its relations with China and superpowers in the 21st century? Are we entering a new global order, or China is just a transient threat to the existing US-dominated international order? How should we as a US ally position ourselves? And can we find a peaceful resolution to the West Philippine Sea disputes? To understand this, we have experts on China. Thank you very much for joining us, Jed and Josh. I think, yes, as always, there's a lot to discuss for today, including the rise of the Philippines as a middle power and the need for us to modernize our armed forces and the need for more strategic autonomy. But first, let's talk about China. China is a big part of our foreign policy nowadays because of the headache and the tensions in the West Philippine Sea. For me, the biggest question right now is, why is China behaving the way it is? And a part of me thinks it's because China is genuinely surprised and perhaps disappointed by the turn of events. I think they had 6 years of Duterte, or at least 4 years of kind of a more subservient, foreign policy under Duterte, and they're kind of used to that. And now under President Marcos Jr., my understanding is this is reversion to the mean, and yet it comes off as something else to China, right? Based on my conversation with China's interlocutors, some of them have their all sorts of theories, including conspiracy theories about why the Philippines, is asserting its claims. Jed, you are a China specialist. You studied in China. You know the system pretty well. You're among the leading experts on China in the country. Can you tell me, what is your understanding of their understanding of the Philippines?
Yeah, okay. So for China, I think when they look at democracies, they basically believe that there will always be continuities in terms of their preferences from President Duterte to President Marcos. But sometimes I think they have some difficulty looking into their own behavior as well. And so when they behave in a certain way, let's say when they assert their claims in the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea, that is perceived differently by the new people, okay, in power. So the Marcos government, the Marcos administration, saw the Chinese behavior differently. So remember when President Marcos just got elected, we
Right.
had the rocket debris
Right.
incident, and then the laser pointing incident. So these actions, I think, hyped the China threat, the narrative to the Marcos
Right.
administration, which they felt warranted. I mean, which I think made them feel that a realignment with the United States is warranted, and also with other like-minded countries. Okay.
To what degree is this China calculating that Marcos Jr. will be more or less Duterte 2.0, right? I mean, I cannot blame China because if you look at the election period, when Marcos Jr. effectively announced his planned to run for the presidency in the third quarter of 2021. I think he had an event with the Filipino-Chinese business community here, and he was all praised for Duterte. You know, the way forward is diplomacy. I agree with Duterte's approach. We cannot afford war. And it was only towards the latter part of the campaign, during one of the few debates he had. This was, when there was a discussion of foreign policy, that he kind of intimated perhaps he'll take a more assertive stance. But he was part of the unity team with the Dutertes. He sounded very much like Duterte. I mean, we have some colleagues who even said, no, Duterte is something, but Marcos will be even more appeasement than Duterte. To what degree do you think that perhaps also informs China's understanding of the Philippines and their shock at how Marcos did not turn out as Duterte 2.0, whatever you want to call it?
Right. Actually, Richard, if we would recall, President Marcos was back then widely seen as the Manchurian candidate, right? And so when he became president, things turned out differently. And so that's what I'm saying. He perceives China's actions very differently compared from the Duterte administration. That's why I think the level of threat that they saw with China's actions clearly necessitated realignment or rebalancing with our allies and partners.
To what degree this is also about China thinking that, well, the number two in power is Duterte. The former president is still very popular and very vocal. He even visited China last year as a special friend of China, back to back with Henry Kissinger, another special friend of China. To what degree do you think China is also calculating that as long as Duterte is there, they will have a kind of a steady base of support in the Philippines that could pressure Marcos Jr. to essentially toe the line? Is there some sort of you think that kind of thinking is also prevalent in the strategic circles in China?
Yeah, so I think with President Sara as a VP, so I think they feel that
who always says no comment, and anytime anything big happens in the South. I mean, that's quite telling. I mean, to be honest, yeah.
So I think they feel that they still have a skin in the game, okay, but it has certain limitations, as we can see with the dominant policy of this administration. And actually, you would also realize, I mean, with President Marcos's policy, that he went to China first, as his...
Just like Duterte. His first major state visit was to China, not to Tokyo, not to Washington, D.C.
Exactly. So he was trying to give our relations with China, our engagement with China, the benefit of the doubt. And so certain events happened after that. There was the laser pointing incident, okay? And then you had the announcement of the expansion of the EDCA sites, okay? And all these things that made things much more
untenable in terms of sticking to the same game. I'll go back to you. I want to also ask Josh about this, but another point I want to also ask you, Jed, is my sense also dealing with scholars in China or some of Chinese students, for instance, who are doing research in the Philippines is that sometimes they say the problem is that there's a caricature view of the Philippines as kind of this is an American satellite state, or the Philippines, if the president is on your side, then everything else will follow. Is it also about lack of appreciation of the complexities and multidimensionality of our, fiesta democracy? That there are multiple veto players. It's just not the president. And it's not like Duterte, or even Marcos for that matter, is a kind of a coherent ideologue who controls the state, right? This is not Marcos' dictatorship era.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of nuances when it comes to our democracy. And I think that's what the Chinese tend to overlook,
Yeah.
When you are friendly with the president, it follows top down.
Chain of command.
That everything will be fine. But sometimes they forget that we have our legislature, independent from the executive, who conducts their own hearings, okay? Senate investigations, and also our own judiciary.
Right.
So
you think they're projecting their own kind of a monolithic system on us, right? They'll think on the surface you're a democracy, but when you deep inside it's still top down. Like, you think there's that kind of a mirroring effect or projection.
Pretty much, yeah. That's how they see it.
Right. What about you, Josh? How do you see this? To what degree do you think that China is genuinely surprised? Because I take a different, everyone's point is like, no, China is just a bully who's not self-aware, which may be true too. But I think there's, to a certain degree, I think China is also honestly shocked by how things are turning out.
Yeah.
What is your take on this?
Well, we have to understand, whenever we think about international relations, I think it's one of the mortal sins of analysts that it's a black billiard ball
Yeah.
It's always the president or the dictator percent making all these decisions. But I think there's a failure, intellectual deficit in understanding that states are not billiard balls. It's not a unitary system. No? That you have to understand that there are many bureaucratic actors here playing this inter-bargaining discussions with each other. So I think in China, one of the grave sins of the Western plus Filipino analysts is that we kind of think that it's always President Xi Jinping. Of course, indeed, there's always this announcements that he would have
Right.
this lifetime term in his tenure as president. But we fail to understand that there might be more dovish or a little bit more rational, if you put it.
Right.
That there's these players that trying to give a little more reason into their foreign policy. But you have to understand that even when rationality is taking place in the decision, there's always this at the back of their heads that perhaps there's an issue of defection on the other side. So we
Right.
cannot afford rationality. The only rational view here is the how we define, how we look at the world according to our national interest. So what's the end game here? Is that we tend to treat China as if it's kind of bully. The bully 100% that they're the evil ones. It's one of the mortal sins of analysis. When you look at your enemies, quote unquote. When you look at your enemies, you have to understand that it's not always they're demons, right? This is not a supernatural game. This is a game of humans. At the end of the day, they're still out there making these sound decisions. However, both sides, both sides of the play are being obscured of the chance to express their ideas here. So, the Philippines, United States, and the Western allies, China. At the end of the day, we're all humans making all these obscurities. Not gonna pretend that we sympathize your side. We're not gonna pretend that we understand what we want. So the end game of what happened, China being shocked of how President Marcos became like this, as we see now, is that I think the best explanation here is the failure to give a rich analysis on our decision making, simply because we want to get what we want, but we fail to understand that others may have a vote on your decisions. When I say that others may have a vote on your decisions, you have to understand that the others may also understand what you want. It's just that there's always a Game of Thrones in decision making. So I think I'll leave it at that. That decision making is a very complex and a very dirty one. So
It's interactive. I mean, it's
It's
game
an
theory.
interactive, right?
I don't know about the Game of Thrones, but definitely this game theory in a sense that
Yeah.
it's iterative, right?
Yeah.
What you do depends on what I do, and depends on what you expect me for you to expect to do,
Yeah.
right? So it's very interactive. It's not like one side does it and the other side just responds.
Yeah.
I want to build on that later on and talk about the West Philippine Sea, because the whole point is we're moving in that direction. But just let me go back to this. My contention is I think many in China are having a caricaturish view of the Philippines, and now they're waking up to the reality that it's not just a one-dimensional country. It's a complex country. We may not be as big as China, but we're not a small country. We're a mid-sized, legitimate mid-sized country of more than 100 million people. But let's talk about China too, in a sense that what do you think we're getting wrong about China? I think Josh was already on it. This idea of don't mystify. Let's get rid of mystification of other countries, right, and demonization of other countries, because that prevents you from coming up with good strategies. I've visited North Korea. I've visited China. I'm familiar with many authoritarian countries, Russia among others. And always when I sit down with my friends from one of these countries, I tend to compare and contrast. And just a few months ago, I found myself with an exiled Chinese friend of mine, and we were comparing Russia and China. And I would say that if you look at Xi Jinping compared to Putin, I think he's a much more rational and sensible leader, especially because he's in charge of a country on the rise, while Russia is a declining superpower in every indicator you look at it. And even on the military front, they're not as impressive as it is. Here in the Philippines, my sense is we have for the lack of a better term, a very Republican understanding of China. And sometimes if you look at even public surveys, right, Russia and China tend to be almost lumped together, when in fact they're totally different systems. Kremlin controls everything in China. It's true that Xi Jinping is the most powerful man, but nevertheless, it's a kind of a robust party-led system. It's a much more complex and sophisticated political system, if I could put it. As someone who understands China, who has spent more time in China than most of us, what do you think we Filipinos or even strategic thinkers in the Philippines get wrong or should get right about China?
Okay, so I think right now, Richard, because of our tensions with China in the West Philippine Sea, our perception of China has been heavily securitized and politicized. And so that has prevented us from looking into the other aspects of the success, for example, of China's economic rise,
Right.
their successful governance practices when it comes to poverty alleviation. So for us, because we are so um, concerned about the West Philippine Sea. Okay, so that becomes front and center
Right.
of our bilateral relations with China. But previously, we've had presidents from President Aquino, President Duterte, and now President Marcos, who still emphasizes that we still need to compartmentalize our relations with China.
Right.
Easier said than done, but other countries are doing it as well, or are
Right.
attempting to do it, like Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan, the US, and the Australians continue to break the ice and talk with the Chinese. Okay, and so I think that's what's lacking in terms of our understanding of China. And the issue of the West Philippine Sea pretty much whatever China does there spills over to
Yeah.
mainland Philippines. For example, if the West Philippine Sea issue is not handled well, then the public in the Philippines will really cast doubt into China's actions, China's public diplomacy efforts, economic initiatives. So that even if China's intentions are good or well intentioned, they are subjected to a lot of skepticism.
Okay, so your point is there are many sides to China, and I think it's increasingly difficult not to see that. I mean, I was just in Amsterdam the other week, and I saw this Chinese electric cars, NIO, NIO, in this posh, nice place in Amsterdam. I was just in Cebu a few days ago. I saw BYD. So, so you see this cool China, right? I mean, if you asked me 10 years ago if you could imagine Europeans and Filipinos salivating over Chinese cars, I would say, come on, you're kidding me, right? I'm saying it as someone who actually always believed in Chinese work ethic and manufacturing prowess. But just the scale and speed by which they're catching up, in fact, overtaking almost everyone in certain sectors like electric cars, is amazing. So I think it's going to be difficult for us to ignore also the cool China that is coming up. Is it really possible to desecuritize our relationship with China when, to be honest, you're dealing with a country which many are saying it's not like they're also innocently approaching innocent. I mean, there are a couple of very credible, authoritative works about internal discussions. Was it Directive Number 8 or something like that, whereby openly you have Chinese officials talking about weaponizing economic interdependence, that their economic and technological prowess could be actually an instrument of a broader goal, a kind of a dominant China paradigm. Realistically, how do you think we can compartmentalize that? Are there lessons that we can learn from other countries? Are there successful countries comparable to us from whom we can learn? I know it's a difficult question, but I think it's an important question because we always hear that, that West Philippine Sea is not the end all be all of our relationship.
Right.
And yet, how can you talk about investments and technology and all of that when it's just too much what's happening in the West Philippine Sea for many people?
Right. Actually, so that's the very difficult part. So I think here we need to segregate between what's sensitive and what's not. Okay. Will this, for example, will this particular project or will this particular investment harm our national security?
Aha.
Okay. Because there's a lot of talk right now about the United Front. Right? So if everything of our relationship or policy issue area with China
Is securitized.
is securitized
Yeah.
or politicized, then we might as well disengage if we no longer see any value in our relationship with China. Or should the approach be we properly regulate these activities so that we always protect our national interest?
Yeah.
And in fact, actually, you mentioned economic interdependence. Actually, that's what China has done had done as well, Richard. So they have the dual circulation policy because they have seen their susceptibility, their vulnerability to possible external sanctions. Okay, they've seen how the West sanctioned Russia when it attacked the Ukraine. Okay, so they're also
And also
hedging.
sanctions on their tech sector. So actually, in on the way from Amsterdam to Hague for an event, I met a Chinese student studying in Netherlands, and he said since last year, Chinese students are prevented from having access to certain semiconductor technology. As you know, Netherlands has the most advanced in terms of lithography and all of that. So you're seeing as early as right now, China is feeling the heat that their access or ability to master some of the most sensitive technologies is already being blocked in the West.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that they're also responding to that. So it's not just China trying to weaponize it. China is also feeling that their own dependence is being weaponized by the
Right.
other side.
And the
right?
same is true for us, actually. So we need to hedge as well.
Yeah.
They continue to diversify our economic partners and security partners, so that we're not just beholden to any one country.
What about you, Josh? What is your read of this as far as China is concerned? Can we realistically compartmentalize, or is it about first we have to settle the West Philippine Sea issue in a certain equilibrium whereby both sides the red lines is clear, then maybe we can go to other sides. I mean, under current condition, do you think it's even? I mean, can you imagine like Marcos talking about big investments from China just as we see this level of tension in the South China Sea, or some sort of sequencing has to happen?
You know what? It's really an important conversation. Whenever I ask my students in my classes, can we compartmentalize?
Yeah.
Or we cannot pretend that there's something big going on out there in our backyard, right? So we have to understand first. Let me just catch off with what Jed mentioned on the compartmentalization. Who will securitize and desecuritize? We have to consider the idea of the Philippines as a democracy. We have to compartmentalize the elites in the general public. If you look at the sentiments of the elites in the general public, it's very much nuanced actually. It's also a mixed bag. For the elites, yes, they're concerned about the overall national security, but they're also concerned about the possible losses in terms of our trade, right? Considering that China is our number one import source for our economy. When you look at the general public, you also have to understand that there are some in the sector of the general public who are really much concerned because of what we have been publishing in our information sphere. But at the same time, we have to also understand that there might be, intricacies in our societal component. You have Filipino-Chinese, you have Chinese communities from mainland China trying to invest here. You have job generation. So you have a Philippines that is, you have a multi-component stakeholdership here. So when it comes to this one, you have to understand that foreign policy, it boils down to the elites, right? It's a painful statement that we have to make, that an elite comprised of those who understand the stakes, the trade-offs. Whenever you make these decisions, you have to understand, if we choose to not compartmentalize, let's give it one scenario. If we choose not compartmentalize, you have to understand that trade diversification is the only way forward. If not, you will have to look at the second scenario. You have to choose, retaining that level of exchange in your trade, in your financing with China. If that is the case, you have to back up your defense capabilities. But the only thing that's going to happen is that the current status quo, right? So what we have to understand here is that there are multiple futures, right? So it's actually, in my understanding, it's for the lack of a better term, it's something that should not be controversial. When it comes to, should be compartmentalized, or should we embrace the idea of the totality of our relationship? So it depends on our intelligentsia, our elites, to think about the trade-offs. I think the problem of our decision making is that we pretend that this is all about zero-sum game, right? So it's either we get everything from China or we don't get everything from China. I think the most prudent way forward is to really diversify. If we cannot make the decision that we are finding it too difficult to compartmentalize with China, because if you look at the idea of, for instance, you talk to the Zambaleños in Palawan, will they accept the idea that we will still be dependent? Or at least we choose to compartmentalize, right? So it really depends now on the voice of those communities. Will they accept these kinds of scenarios? It's one of the ironies, actually, that that I attended a conference whereby one of the fisherfolk leaders mentioned that why is that by this time the Philippines is actually fighting for its right, but at the same time the scale of the conflict or the violence or the danger has scaled up. There's an irony. So I think my idea here is that we have to communicate to the people about the risks of all the choices that the country is going to make. But if you ask me, it's one of the humble opinions out here is that trade diversification is the only way forward if under the assumption that we cannot choose to compartmentalize.
Can I go back to this issue? Speak of our relationship with China on the economic front. Well, it's true that, there's certain families and conglomerates who are very dependent on imports from China. It's certainly true that we have huge trade. But first of all, this is a very imbalanced trade. We have huge deficits with China. So they're earning way more out of us than the other way around. Many would argue that a lot of our manufacturing got essentially eviscerated when we open up ourselves to China, and there are accusations that a lot of Chinese products are heavily subsidized. There's dumping, a lot of that happening. Just go to the WTO cases. But for me, even more importantly, why on earth didn't China invest big time when they had a good relationship with the Philippines during Duterte, right? Everyone was worrying about debt trap. And as someone who's been following China all across the global south, I followed in Africa, I followed in the Middle East, I said, forget about it. It's going to be pledge trap. A lot of empty pledges, but not much is going to come true. Now, partisans of China would give me a lot of reasons. They blame our bureaucracy, they blame pandemic, etc., etc. And we'll talk later about Malaysia and other countries because these countries also have a different take on this. But why during Duterte? This was their golden opportunity to invest big and win over the Filipinos. Or even do something that they did, like for instance, in African Union building. They didn't even do a white elephant project here, right? To win over the Filipino people. The Mindanao. What is your read, Jed? I have my own read on this issue. I've been writing on this issue for the past 5-6 years, so I think you know where I'm coming from. But what is your take? Why didn't China invest big time?
Actually, I've read your pieces on that, Richard, that this is not, as you argue, this is not
Debt trap, it's pledge trap, yeah.
pledge trap. Actually, so if we would look at the data, actually, so number one, it's very true that China did not live up to the expectation of actualizing the more than $30 billion of investments
Pledges,
and aid that they had pledged. But actually, some of them, if not completed, actually did commence during the time of President Duterte. So we also draw a distinction there: commenced and completed project. Okay, some have commenced but are not yet completed. So therefore, we cannot say that they are completed projects already. So these are projects like apart from the bridges, Kaliwa Dam.
Okay, let me be clear.
But of course, they're anomalous.
Big ticket infrastructure project. I'm not talking about some beautification of some bridge here or like a 4-lane bridge in the middle of a 2-lane. No, I'm talking about like big ticket infrastructure projects, like the subway project that Japan is doing. That's big ticket. Or the Bandung Jakarta project that China did at I think only 1% interest rate or 1.5% Indonesia. Right. Why don't we have any of that? I mean, the reason I'm saying that is. Remember, early on in the Marcos administration, there were 3 railway projects by China that were suspended because there was no money coming in. The pipeline was just empty. So I understand your argument that, of course, if you want big ticket infrastructure project, you cannot expect that in 1 or 2 or 3 years even, that billions are going to come in. But I would argue that even some of the commenced one are either not really commenced or like the dam project had environmental concerns about this, right? So for me, the reason I'm saying this is because, Jed, all of us grew up studying China as this kind of a sophisticated 1,000-year marathon statecraft nation. But when I look at how China and Philippine relationship works in reality, it's not a very sophisticated setup. It's a messy one, isn't it? I mean, or correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, that's my read of the situation.
Yeah, so that is one issue, Richard, whether or not China actualized the billions of investments. And second issue is whether or not the projects are controversial, which are 2 separate issues. So on the first one, like I said, well, to China, because these are, to them, are big ticket already, the dams and the irrigation river projects, among others. But if you would also look, Richard, at in terms of investments, Alvin wrote about this. During Duterte's time, the number of Chinese firms registered in the Philippines actually increased. and also the number of Chinese investments. Okay, so these are not hard physical infra projects, but Chinese investments coming into the Philippines, not pogos. Okay, increased.
We'll talk about that
Yeah,
shortly. Yeah. We're
yeah.
going there, yeah.
So it could be that it's very paltry compared to what has been pledged, but there is a difference, I would say, between something and nothing at all. That something is little, okay? And so I think what would be good for China going forward is that they could pledge less so that they could lessen the expectation and they could deliver
point.
more. I think that would be much better.
My problem with the, I don't know, portfolio investment or whatever other investment is that we also saw that during Aquino. So if you look at the Aquino period, a lot of these investments were still coming in. And naturally, as the Philippine economy becomes bigger, naturally as more opportunities comes, I mean, with 6-7% growth. So the reason I'm mentioning big ticket infrastructure project, because for me, the quotient of sensitivity to geopolitics should be higher, right? Because it's almost a concessional project, right? Or supposed to be. Like, I'll invest because we have a good relationship. While those private investments you're talking about, I think they're geopolitically neutral almost, in a sense that they're more about market conditions on the ground. Do you get what I'm saying? So I'm not sure citing those investments really advances the thesis that China was strategic about its, because we're talking about state-driven, state bank-driven projects, which obviously means directive coming from Xi Jinping. While those investments you're talking about are individual decisions of smart Chinese investors who want to take the risks and look at the rewards, which we also saw during the Aquino administration. So I completely see, thank you for the clarification, that it's not true that Chinese investment has not been coming in, but that's why I specified big ticket infrastructure projects which have high quotient of sensitivity to, or at least supposedly to, good geopolitical relationship, right? The reason I'm saying that is because the Philippines was not even part of the BRI initially, right? Or we didn't want to be part of the BRI initially during Aquino time. So that's the reason I'm trying to deconstruct this as much as possible. Or the other thing I mentioned a while ago, like Xi Jinping made the political decision that the Bandung-Jakarta project will be really low interest rate. So the market rate is between 3 to 4%. But that one, I think 1.5%. And it was a decision that Xi Jinping made after his important speech in Jakarta more than a decade ago. Why didn't he do that in the Philippines? Like, for me, it's a puzzle. How China lost the Philippines. That's my argument. Because they had a golden opportunity during Duterte to seal the deal. Because we'll discuss that separately. The U.S. is not offering much. Like, what is the U.S. investments in terms of big ticket infrastructure investments, right? So I just want to understand that, yeah.
So when we talk about infrastructure also, Richard, so there's hard physical infrastructure projects and there's also the soft infrastructure projects. So during the President Duterte's time, so we had the third telco, right? Our third telco partnered with China Mobile, I believe. Yeah. So I think that is also considered as a state-led investment. Now, you talked about the 3 rail projects a while ago. From what I read, these 3 got scuttled or were aborted because there were no proper feasibility studies that were conducted. They're not really that profitable, and there are issues concerning right of way.
Right.
So that's on our end. So I think in the future we should be more circumspect about really including what projects to include, so that we do not disappoint the public. Yeah, and I would agree if there would be more subway projects, let's say in Cebu or in other
railways, because China is very good in railway projects.
Yes. And these are very tangible projects that the public would really appreciate, right?
It
because
gives
they can ride on
dividends.
it.
Yeah, I mean, look at in Africa, a lot of people like China way more than the West, because where's the Western product? But they can show stadiums and African Union buildings, and you can question that and say, oh, it's performative or whatever. But at least there's something concretely there. Or in Indonesia, the Bandung Jakarta project, which by the way had a lot of right of way problems too and got delayed. But eventually it finished, and that was Jokowi's crowning jewel by the end of his administration. What about you, Josh? What is your read of this? Because my interpretation of where Jed is coming from, and you're not the only one who made this point. I saw some pushback against my argument, which is, no, you have to break it down further. But I think the even stronger counter argument would be, this is birth pains also for China. They haven't been dealing with the Philippines for a long time. They tried during Arroyo administration. It went off the rails, literally and figuratively. This is their second try. And in fact, the more interesting argument I heard, Josh, is may kasalanan din ng Philippine government because there were a lot of corrupt and questionable people in the Philippines pretending to represent Duterte. Like, there was one guy who supposedly had a business card said Governor of Visayas or something. Like, so lots of dodgy things happen. So in short, 6 years was too short considering yung baseline.
Yeah.
That maybe if this was given more time, China would get it right. I'm gonna get it right in terms of giving nuance to this. I'm trying to be fair also to China. Josh, what is your read of this, the whole thing? Or do you have a completely different paradigm in terms of understanding China's economic
If
strategy
you
in
look
the
at
Philippines?
the across administrations, I would say the economic theme of each president, is sincere. But sincerity is not equal to effectiveness,
competence, yeah.
wisdom, competence, the gains that we need to get. So my reading here is that the next thing I'm very much interested in, if under Marcos administration today, China won't get that chance, will they get another chance across administrations?
Yes.
And the argument here is that perhaps yes. That's right. So I would say yes because China at least projects to be promising, and it's
Right.
very much reflective of what's happening in the global south, right? As you guys have mentioned on the railways, etc. So the only question here is that shall we learn from all these lessons?
Right.
When I say shall we learn, at the end of the day, what do we want? And I'd like to make the connection here of the birth pains of our. I would not say it's a golden age. We have to push back against the idea that Arroyo or even Duterte was the golden age. I would say the golden age of our relations hasn't arrived yet. It's still on the
Bronze
probing.
Age.
We're still in the probing stage, if I would put
Yeah.
it that way. So I think the next generation,
That's a good point.
I think the next generation would have to get all these lessons. I don't know who shall be the next president by 2028 and beyond, but I think what we need to get from this is the idea that China is really hell-bent on becoming the next economic superpower, if you put it that way, taking advantage of the United States, relative decline,
Yeah.
and ASEAN's, very divisive conception of our economic community. And at the same time, the global south is trying to look for saviors, for investments, things like that. So the Philippines stands at a very interesting time, while everyone's figuring out what we want,
Right.
including China. That's also the time that we can figure out how do we contribute to this order that's happening here right now. And this is something that I would always want to push as a thesis. We have to be order contributors. The Philippines has to be an order contributor, meaning to say we should not just enforce what the United States has imposed on us or have imposed on everyone. Neither should we, repudiate these norms that we have established since the end of the Second World War, like China, as what China is doing with UNCLOS, right, and other stuff. So the Philippines' conception of its economic setup, the way we relate to China, we have to understand, at least our elites have to understand, our managers for the next generation have to understand that we're trying to push for, a more proper order that is beholden to our national interest. So to sum it all up, I think we haven't arrived at the golden age. We're still
So
at
this
the
is still
probing
the
stage.
getting to know each other
Yes, we're
stage.
still, very ironic.
It's still strategic flirtation,
yeah,
right? We're still getting to know each
and
other.
it's very much interesting considering the long history of our peoples. But we have to understand that there's a big difference of China as a civilization and the China as a nation state as we know today. There are a lot of
And
debates
this
out there.
China, which is a tech superpower,
Yeah.
which many people didn't foresee just 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think it's also about China also learning how to, it's beginning to carve out a new space for
Yeah.
itself. And now China is also a technological power that
Yeah.
we can benefit from. So what you're saying is that we just have to understand that there were mistakes made along
Yeah.
the way and both sides can be blamed for that. But this shouldn't be the end of the
Yeah.
story. Yeah.
At the end of the day, China's made so much miscalculations on the Philippines. I would
Right.
say a lot of the adage that you can have your propaganda but don't believe in your own propaganda. I would
Yeah.
say China's believed in its own propaganda. That it is now a rising power. That the Philippines is just a U.S. pawn, which I very vehemently disagree because we are not sophisticated. Actually, we are not so sophisticated. We have been making mistakes, which tells us so much that we are not a US pawn. Had we been a US pawn, things would have been more orderly, if I would put it that way. Our agency is not perfect, which means prudence has to take place. That's the only logical thing that needs to take place, right? So the idea here is that we need to push the discussion that figuring out what our interests are, our economic, our geopolitical, our security interests, has to be taken into one grand narrative. I mean, if you look at this one, it sounds spiritual, right? But the argument here is that what does the nation want, right? If the nation would have been able to identify what it wants, then perhaps, my argument is this, perhaps we would have been better negotiators with our relations with China, right? So the golden age would be just described by the historians. But our role as analysts, policymakers, managers of the state would have to figure out the national interest. The idea of the golden age is not for us to describe these things. Actually, the idea here is that we're just going to do what we need to do.
So the golden age is an aspiration, not yet a reality, but it's an aspiration worth pursuing. But there's no way we're gonna end this episode on China without talking about pogos, because if there's one area where the Chinese government and the Philippine government are on the same page, is that pogos are bad, right? In fact, way before the Philippine government banned pogos, at least officially, it was China was begging the Philippines to stop. And in fact, the pogos gave a bad name to China and a bad name even to Chinese citizens. And you had the, well, now not so curious case of Alice Go, which, I think the reality has come out. What is your take on the whole pogo chapter in Duterte-Philippine-China relations?
Well, as you can see, Richard, the reason why so many people equate pogos to China is because of our view of China as a monolithic state, party state actor. That the party state calls all the shots, they're involved in everything, they run the show. Despite the fact that the Chinese government itself had cracked down on their own tech industry. Look at Jack Ma. What happened to Jack Ma? See? And here, in the case of pogos, these are basically private Chinese individuals who came here simply because they want to profit, okay? And that's why they're here, not in China, because gambling is illegal in China. And what this has done in Chinese society is that it had caused the divorce of various couples, because the money which should be spent for their families have gone into gambling.
Online
okay?
gambling.
So that's creating
social crisis,
It's instability, yes.
Which is a number one sensitivity for the ruling party.
Exactly.
In
So
China.
there's a lot of capital outflow as well. So that's why the Chinese government kept on telling us that we should ban this. Okay?
Kept telling Duterte.
President Xi told President Duterte.
And Duterte said no. The one time he said no to China wasn't the pogo issue,
Yeah,
right?
so he said he'll think about it. So Richard,
No, he didn't say. He said it's important for national economic survival, and was saying, I don't know about national, but maybe some people's economic survival, right?
So he welcomed all forms of capital, And so I think this notion that, and this is part of the United Front, and I think needs to be
Can you talk about that? Because you correctly mentioned the securitization of Parla. This distinct finding a spy behind every Chinese citizen. I think it's very problematic. It's very prejudicial. We have to fix that.
So when President Marcos, in his latest SONA, announced that he will ban pogos, a few days later, the Chinese embassy issued a statement, and they welcomed it. Okay. So if your enemy is telling you to ban it,
there must be something.
Why would they want to use that for espionage? Right?
What is your understanding of the Alice Go situation? Because everyone thought, everyone's saying. I mean, I even have Chinese Filipino friends telling me, tall tales about what their understanding of the situation. And I think a lot of our Chinoy brothers and sisters were also worried that this could have, kind of a blowback effect on because again, I think it was legitimate that Mayor ex or soon to be ex Mayor Alice saw all of that scrutiny, but there was also indeed a level of prejudice and racism I saw in the comment sections of many social media. What is your understanding of that period?
Just hinging on what you mentioned, there's also a big difference on the idea that while at the domestic level, it's very much detrimental to Chinese interests, but on the international, right? At the international scene, everything is chaotic, right? Chaos is the order, meaning to say that I'm gonna push back a little bit on the idea that China really against the Philippines
Welcoming.
welcoming these pogos? I would have to put a benefit of the doubt for the reason that whatever's useful, however chaotic, that's the order of things at the international level. So meaning
What
to
do you
say,
mean by that? I mean,
Yeah,
these are they're syndicate groups, triads from China. So you
yeah.
think
So
Chinese government may leverage them for something else? Is that what you're
it's not
saying?
that leverage, but China leverages on the order at the international
Mm.
level, meaning to say that of course China cannot govern, outside its borders. So whatever these triads do at the international level, outside its borders rather, is may or may not be useful to them. And it turns out that it's not useful to them because of the reason of the projection issues. But the idea here is this. If China is all too worried about its reputational costs because pogos are being tagged to China, well, what's happening in the West Philippine Sea? If the Chinese are really that concerned with their reputational costs, so connecting it with Alice Go, well, things turned out to be ugly. So we're not gonna be leveraging these things.
So what do you think about the whole tale that maybe she's a united front? I mean, not so front. I mean, spy or something like that. I mean, what do you think that kind of discourse says? You think China would use some syndicates or pogos as a front for their operations here, in intelligence operations in the Philippines?
I think we can ask the intelligence community for that because I don't have the information for that. But the idea, I leave a principle here that whatever's useful, truth or lies, legal or legal, may always be useful by the time it's useful, by the time it can be leveraged. It's all about timing. The temporal dimension of interacting with each other is always paramount. So it's just that the reality, the scenario that happened is that here you have Senator Risa and Senator Gatchalian probing on these activities and the profile of the soon to be
Ex-mayor.
ex-mayor. Sorry, so it's a mouthful of words.
Soon to be ex-mayor.
Soon to be, all right, mouthful of words. So the idea here is that the principle we have to lay out is that it seems that Alice Go, or Guoping, as they call her, turns out is not so much useful. But had she been very much useful, I would say perhaps yes, because I cannot leave the idea that if you look at the footages of raids in Pogos, you have uniforms, badges, badges and commendations.
So you're not ruling out potential
I'm
infiltration
not ruling out that
or
idea
double
because-
agents or something
I'm
like
not
that.
ruling out that idea because perhaps it's truthful, perhaps it's not, because that is always the shadow of intelligence operations. We have to put under the understanding to the public that, of course, whereas it's not all about James Bond, Mission Impossible scenario, but there are also much more subtle realities happening out there. So perhaps if I would say, oh, it's entirely purely business, I may have, I may have putting out the possibility that it's harmless, but I don't have that data. So my analysis here is to call for the security authorities. It's very telling about the security and intelligence communities about the idea that we have not been so much protective of our borders, right? Of our homeland security, if you put it. So the idea that we have muddled through Alice Go, because the accusation of Alice Go is that if I am guilty, you should charge me at the local courts, but you're not. So the idea here is that we have to understand the idea that there might be 50-50 on this one, but leave it at be that as it may, it would need to call upon our authorities to to push the idea that we need more security on our borders. You have customs, you have immigration, because we cannot rule out the possibility that Alice Go is just one of the
Tip of the iceberg in that sense.
There might be more Alice Goes.
Yeah.
It's just so happened that she was exposed or she was probed.
Right.
Right,
Or
so-
the one that was exposed was not necessarily spy, but that doesn't rule out.
Yeah.
Just last point on this, there's so much more to discuss, Jet. Just your final points, but I also want to ask you guys, what do you think should, very briefly, what do you think should China approach be in terms of its economic strategy in the Philippines? What is the way forward, having supposedly learned all of our from the mistakes of the past?
Well, I think, Richard, it really boils down to the management of, the West Philippine Sea issue. Because if it's not managed well, doubts will continue to rise
Right.
about China's intentions in mainland Philippines. Okay, but if it's handled well, which I think we are already doing right now with the recent RORE mission, so I think we can focus now more on the pragmatization or functionalization
Mm.
of other policy issue areas.
So in short, I think goes back to my argument about sequencing. I mean, you have to first stabilize the West Philippine Sea situation so that we can talk
Yes.
about the bigger picture.
Because it is the source of mistrust
Yeah,
of our
it's too much talks. You have to
bilateral ties.
detox
Yeah.
first the relationship. I think that's the way. Yeah.
Richard, if I may just qualify, I'd like to follow through with what Josh just said about the POGOs. I think Alice Go could have been fielded by the criminal syndicates as their sleeper cell,
Yeah.
And this model of so Senator Gatchalian said it, narco politics to Pogo politics. So they field their own politicians, they take care of them until they reach the peak perhaps of their political career, and they can do whatever they want. So even if this is done by criminal syndicates, this model could also be available to state actors. Okay, and well, actually, as to the uniform, it's like in front of Camp Crame, Josh,
Yeah.
where you can buy police and military uniforms. In
Yeah.
China, you also have that. And in one of the uniforms that was found, there was a seal of the Band of Brothers on the camouflage in the. So perhaps they just got it
So-
somewhere and just tried
But
to
what
play
about the
soldier.
PLA IDs or something like that?
I-
So, okay, so essentially, I'm not saying you guys are disagreeing, but each of you are emphasizing different point. What
Yeah.
Josh is saying is that we cannot rule out the possibility. What you're saying is that let's also not exaggerate some of the smoke we're seeing and panic over that this is primarily a law enforcement issue
Yeah.
rather than a counter espionage issue. There's so much more to discuss, especially in Philippines, China when it comes to South China Sea, West Philippine Sea dispute, and also our relationship with the US and other partners. But for this episode, thank you very much. I just realized even an hour would not be enough to discuss China, but I'm glad that we try to provide a more nuanced view.
Yeah.
And I think all of us were strangely cautiously optimistic that we can still put this bilateral relationship on an even keel at some point in the future, as long as we learn the lessons of the past and not insist on a kind of a caricaturish view of each other. And I think that goes both ways. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for that fantastic discussion.
Thank you, Richard.
Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Heydarian, and that was The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.